just war theory. We're going to kind of top off a few things that we talked about in discussion on Thursday and add a few more pieces that we didn't get to as part of this, hopefully, rather brief lecture. Now, usually we talk about just war beginning with Augustine, and in some ways it does. He's certainly going to be the first to kind of directly try to analyze the question about whether or not one should go to war, something that's rather taken for granted in the ancient world. But there are precedents about rules for warfare that date back to the Greeks that we ought to stop and mention. A couple of them are, one, there was not to be any poisoning of wells, and there was to be a limited destruction of crops. In other words, this was seasonal warfare. It wasn't supposed to last forever, and it wasn't supposed to destroy your enemy utterly. You weren't supposed to attack sacred sites like the Grove of Dondana that belonged to Zeus, or obviously the Oracle at Delphi. There was not supposed to be wholesale enslavement of Greek cities simply because this was seasonal warfare. There was a truce at the end of a battle for the burial of the dead, for you to take care of your dead, and for people going back and forth to the Pan-Hellenic Games, the Olympic Games being the most important of them, but not the only one. Now, the reality is these are the rules, but that doesn't mean they played by it. You guys read read the Melian dialogue, and Athens is going to enslave all of Melos, if not destroy it. Certainly by the time we get into this Peloponnesian War, we're going to see attacking of sacred sites. We're going to see attacks on the crops and eventually poisoning of wells as well. Delphi is going to get sacked twice. We're also going to see, we're going to see several of these pieces. And we also see in literature the violation of these, most notably in Sophocles' play, The Antigone, which is about where Antigone not being allowed to do the proper rites of burial for her brother. She's supposed to be able to do this, and she can't. So she does it anyway, and she gets into arguments with the powers that be. But the gods are going to deem her to be the righteous one, not him. Now, Augustine does actually begin to address this more directly in the City of God, and I give you the references here just in case you need them. The most direct, though, the others kind of hit it piecemeal, but in Book 19, we really see this directly developed, this concept of just war, where he asks this question. And he says some wars have to be fought to punish injustice. He's very clear that he talks about Romans 13. He says governments have this authority. They bear the sword. So they have to be able to do this. Now, he says the jus ad bellum is the right to go to war. Okay, that they have the right to go to war. But there should be a just cause, because he's in the time frame when we're beginning to see more and more Christian rulers. Obviously, he's in 410. He's writing this between 413 and 426. And so you have Christian rulers at this point who are under attack. And he's going to say, well, that gives you right to go to war. He's also going to talk about jus in bello, that one should have just conduct in war, that you should behave in a fashion that is in line with your cause, not going to be kind of invalidating your just cause by your behavior towards various people. But he doesn't develop these theories nearly as fully as what we'd like, which is why we tend to turn to Thomas Aquinas. But Aquinas is not the first of these guys to really discuss this. In fact, Aquinas is going to be building on some developments that happen in between Augustine and Aquinas that have to do with practicalities of war. And those practicalities are going to be bound up in the peace of God and the truths of God, both of which I gave you as handouts that you'll find on Canvas and related to this. The Peace of God movement was centered in France. It begins around 989, which is at the tail end of the Viking invasions and Hungarian invasions, which largely end around the 950s and 960s. But you also get a few Saracen invasions as well. In other words, we've had to grow a warrior culture to deal with all of these enemy invasions. And now, what do we do with all these knights running around in people's gardens and doing who knows what? Well, they issue a statement. This is the peace of God, and you are not to violate the Pax Dei, the peace of God. And it declares non-combatants off limits. Okay. Now, and it has very specifics. It was trying to define the limits of warfare and the limits of violence, and spelled out, don't steal from the church. You can't attack anyone in a church. No attacking women or children or clergy or peasants, which was a specific list of what everything that they had actually been doing. Okay. We have reports of church services with knife fights in the back during the Middle Ages. So this is very much in that line. But we're also seeing here a list of who is considered vulnerable. The clergy are not arms-bearing people, nor are peasants. Now, the women and children that's a traditional list of vulnerable in society, that you don't engage in warfare. But priests were also part of that list. But now we're going to add peasants, because peasants are critical to our survival. They are the food supply. You don't attack them. The reality is they were also not going to be any kind of challenge for a guy on horseback with a sword. They might have had a pitchfork, but that's about it. And now it makes air warfare an aristocratic pastime, but the reality is it already was. Now this will be augmented by the truce of God about 40 years or so later in 1027. And they're going to add to the list of things you're not supposed to do if you're going to be a Christian knight. Now notice, this is quite some time before we come up with the concept of chivalry. Chivalry is going to be built on this and this idea of it. Now we're going to limit your time frame of when you can attack things. You can't fight on Thursdays or Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays. Thursdays are Holy Thursday. Fridays are when Christ goes to the cross. Saturdays when he's in the grave, and Sunday is Holy Day, Resurrection Day. So, and when they also had a tradition of Holy Mondays, and there were lots of feast days. So we've only left you Tuesday and Wednesday, and a lot of those will be feast days and holy days too. So we're really trying to circumscribe it. You also weren't supposed to kill any fellow Christians. Now that leaves anybody who's considered to be an infidel, obviously Muslims and Jews, as fair game. The reality is they didn't follow these always. They didn't have lip service to it. If you're going to go to war, you're going to have a list of reasons why you can go to war with a Christian prince. And more than that, you're going to have the blessing of the church. A churchman somewhere, you may have had to bribe him, but a churchman who will bless your cause. In the case of William the Conqueror's invasion of England, he's carrying a papal banner. I had the blessing of the Pope. I'm on a holy cause. And all of them are going to have this kind of listing of grievances. This is why and I talked about the investiture controversy, when you get the emperor and the pope exchanging blows, why this is so traumatic for both sides. And actually, it's not something that's just going to be relegated to that one incident, because it's actually going to be a similar problem between Pope and Holy Roman Emperor in the era of Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas kind of assumes some of that conflict, and he doesn't always tell you that that's what's going on. Now, one of the things that's going to be considered by Aquinas and others is about whether or not a Christian prince even should go to war at all. Could they go to war? Particularly given that Christ causes peace and not war. And so the general feeling in both Aquinas and in Augustine is that you shouldn't be rushing into one, particularly if it's a Christian prince, which is more of an issue in Aquinas' day than it is in Augustine's. Now, Aquinas says that in order to go to war, you have to have a war declared by a properly instituted authority. And we touched on this Thursday in class, but I want to hit it again. This constituted authority means that you can't have gotten into power by usurpation or assassination or bribery. And it has to be somebody who's got authority here. And you have to have a declaration of intent. Now, the assumption is that that properly instituted authority, meaning a properly instituted authority with both approvals from church and nobility, will also have the blessing of the church to go to war. This has to be done by a natural state, not an unnatural one. Okay, that's what we mean here. And it has to be a state that represents the common good. Okay, it can't just be this fly by the night, seat of the pants operation that you've created for the sole purposes of going to war. We also want to see a just purpose or just cause. Once again, this is an issue here. But he's going to be a lot more specific than Augustine. Augustine just assumes that you're going to war to stop injustice. But Aquinas says it can't be for self-gain. It has to be about restoring the good. You can't just go because you want to show off your exercise of power or because I want X pound of territory. Now, I can go to war to restore something to my self. This is going to be the justification of the English going to war to get the French crown, is that they were duly owed it, and therefore we could restore it to ourselves. And the French claim is going to be that we need to restore it to ourselves and that you guys are the usurpers. You can see where this goes. But peace is supposed to always be a central motive because a Christian prince is supposed to be obligated to war, not to peace, not to war. There has to be a right intention of both the soldier and the ruler for this to be correct. Now, just war theory will jump ahead again, though, in the 1400s, late 1400s and into the 1500s, because a new problem has occurred on the horizon, and that is the Americas. It's one thing when all of your princes are, well, Christians. Now, the Reformation will add in a new question, and we'll deal with that more about resistance theory. But certainly the question of whether or not you could go to war was to maintain the religious unity of the body politic is going to become a question in Europe. But for the Spanish, that's less of an issue. That's not something that plagues them internally, but they are going to have the question of the New World and what to do and when was war justified here. And that's where Friar Francisco de Vitoria comes in. There he is. The conquest of the New World had people doubting the Pope's temporal authority to a point. It also had them doubting their Aristotelian worldview of here were new people and how does this go in and when can we declare war and when can we not. Now, honestly, Cortez doesn't care with the Aztecs. He's going to go in, and if there's anybody hunting for a righteous cause, stopping human sacrifice is going to be number one on the list. Cortez doesn't have any questions about what he's doing. It's being a just thing, sort of thing. He also doesn't go in with any other kind of idea that that's what he's going to do, even before he finds that. So, but in 1532, Vitoria writes this De jure bella Hispanorum in Barbados. In other words, on the wars of of Spain in the barbarian areas, what we now call Barbados and the other places. And he says, okay, there's a couple of reasons why you could go to war with these native peoples. And he's real clear about this. And he's writing after actually kind of in between the Aztecs and the Incas are about to start. Okay. And the first thing he says is that if the natives are seeking to stop Spaniards living in peace in the area, which some Amerindians obviously chose to do, then you could go to war to defend your right to be there, because after all, the Pope had authorized it. If they were attempting to return converts to Christianity, to idolatry, this would constitute injustice, and therefore you could deal with that. And you could also go into saving innocents from unjust death, i.e. human sacrifice. Now, this is going to get some loopholes thrown in there by some conquistadors, and they're going to find any loophole that's possible. All right. And the Salamanca School is going to expand more and more on this, and make certain that they've got all the ands, ifs, buts, and maybes kind of carried over here. And they list under their right causes for war: self-defense, defense of others, preventive war against a tyrant, or punishing an enemy. And all opportunities for dialogue must be used. In other words, you have to present them with their options so that we could find another way past war, that you would convert to Christianity, that we can find another way to get around this. Okay. And they also argue for right conduct in war. You need a declaration of intent. And many of this is beginning to sound very familiar. They're going to add to it. They're not going to really subtract anything from what Aquinas and Augustine has done. But you also, they add in that whatever your warfare is needs to be proportional. It shouldn't be any longer than you need it to be. You should have no more violence than necessary. Okay. If this has been a minor attack, you only need to punish those who were involved in the small attack, not wholesale genocide. Okay. And they create distinctions of non-combatants and set some moral limits to what you can and cannot do in warfare. The reality is, though, conquistadors on the ground didn't always follow it. They find where it's wounded, and the most famous of them is, in fact, not Cortez and the Incas, Cortez and the Aztecs, but it was rather Francisco Pizarro and the Incas. Famously, the priest with Pizarro is going to present the Incan chief with a copy of the Bible in Spanish. The Incas have no written language. They have no context for this. They don't know what this is. And you just hand me this book. I don't know what this is. And he just tosses it on the ground. Well, the conquistadors' pet priest will declare this properly to be sacrilege and blasphemy. And yes, you can go to war with them. And this is probably the worst of the loopholes that they'll find. But certainly, when you've got a conquistador who wants to go to war, he'll find a way around it. But he'll probably try and take a priest along with him to bless what he's going to do, because he wants God on his side. I put that in quotes. But we also need to be careful of too much condemnation, at least of Cortez. Cortez certainly goes in with the intention of conquest. But Cortez is also properly horrified when he encounters for the very first time human sacrifice. He feels like he's encountered something straight out of the Old Testament. And he immediately starts writing back to Spain saying, you need to send me some friars to do some preaching, because I'm a soldier and these people need God and I got nothing, people. I'm out of my depth. I need someone to come and preach to these people. So we should give him at least that much. Now, there's going to be a real leap forward in the 1600s in terms of discussion of this. And it's interesting that we get this from places where the questions of religion are already settled. In Spain, where Spain's dealing with an enemy not at home, but overseas. And it's also going to come from the Dutch, who have actually settled the issue in terms of Protestantism. They're not having their wars are with with Catholics outside of their country, but not so much inside the Dutch Republic. And that brings us to Hugo Grotius. Grotius, you'll hear Grotius and you'll hear Grotius. I've heard both pronunciations. Take your pick. Grotius is going to be a Dutch thinker and writer and politician. He serves in the States General in Holland at different points. And he's going to write a number of works and a lot of letters. One of his significant ones is going to be called the Mare Liberum, which means the law of the sea. This is the freedom of the seas. And one of the inventions of the Dutch in this period is the question of freedom of the seas, that you should be able to sail the high seas with impunity, and that no one should be able to restrict free passage on the seas themselves. And we'll eventually bind this into international law, and eventually into not just international law about the sea, but on the air as well. This is where we get our concept of international waters and high seas is from Grotius. But he also writes another one on the laws of war and peace, which he's going to be discussing just war, which is what we're going to talk about here. He also writes another one has some commentaries on the laws about prize and booty that was very much in operation in his own day. But that one, you'll notice, is not published until 1868 because it's almost lost to it. One of his heirs actually finds Grotius's notes on this. This is like his great-grandson who finds these and puts them together and publishes them with his ancestor's name on them, and rightfully so. But we don't get that until 1868. And then in the 19th century, they really take these things to heart as they're reconsidering things. He's sometimes called the father of natural law. Certainly, he has a lot to say about it. And he's going to predate Locke on this as well as Hobbes. He's going to discuss in his questions, he's going to discuss God still as the founder of all nations and as the founder of law. But he is going to argue for more universality position rather than, in fact, a just God created the nations themselves. His innate moral value about actions is often taken by the 18th century and the 19th century as more secular, even though he really was very, very religious. But he's trying to kind of take this as from a very analytical sort of position. He argues for three types of law, and this is what's interesting. He argues for divine law over here and natural law separately. Natural law that governs how humanity operates, which is derived from divine law, but is not always the same thing. That divine moral law is superior to natural law in his estimations. But he also says that there's another one, which is the laws of nations, which is his precursor kind of to what we would now call international law. And he's going to write a great deal about this. And he's actually going to say that according to all three types, war is justifiable. And he's going to develop this in a really thorough fashion. He's going to look at different types of actions about what's morality and what's deceitfulness and what kind of deceitfulness is justifiable. And he's going to draw lots of categorizations. Very, very analytical kind of writing. He says that war is compatible with and compelled by law. All three types of law: natural, international, and divine. That there are reasons to go to war, and governments must, in fact, do this on occasion. And then he has a detailed systematic analysis of what constitutes a just cause and what doesn't. Now, some of this we've seen a little bit in the School of Salamanca, which predates him a bit, and also what we get in Aquinas. Self-defense, absolutely. Reparation of injury, yes. Punishment for an offense is, but he defines very clearly what the types of offenses are acceptable for this. He says, though, that if you want impunity for whatever it is that you intend to do in this war, you're going to have to actually have a declaration. You can't sneak attack and then say, oh, but this was just war. No, you have to announce your intentions. You can see some real interesting things here because it leads into the thinking of the 19th century and the early 20th about submarine warfare, that somehow this was not playing correctly because you were not announcing your intentions, you were playing sneakily. He says natural law is unsatisfactory for the basics of ethics and combat because that's just what governs men's actions. It's not really moral law. He says you're going to need divine law as well as the law of the nations here. You're going to need humanity and justice and necessity for the guides. What is the most just thing to do? What's the most humane thing to do? And what is actually necessary for combat. He says also to be careful of burdensome reparations in peace, something that echoes a lot in people's minds in the aftermath of the Second World War. And we see this. Well, that ends our discussion of just war for now. And I'll see you back in the next installment of my lectures where I'm going to be talking about the body politic and resistance theory. And I'll see you then. If I can figure out how to turn it off. There